اي اي.
عشان نكسب وقت لانه بعدين الكلتشر والكور هذا راح يكون مشكله عندنا. نشوف شو بدنا نسوي كمان.
نحكي الاناونسمنت ونقدم جواب. يلا هات اجيب بس يخف الدم السؤال.
يعني انت مرات ما تسمحيش لحالك
لا
ولا
انا
خفيف الدم.
لا بس الناس هيك بتاخذ من البروسيد انا كثير صير امشي الشيلي بس
لا بس بحكي لك يعني
بسمح لحالي
برزنت يور سيلف انه
بس بسمح لحالي. Yeah. Welcome back, everyone. I do need your attention. Thank you. A couple of announcements before we proceed with our program. We have a tour at 1, the political and cultural tour in Bethlehem with Salim Anfous. He's going to meet you at the entrance, so be there at time. Don't forget to pick up your lunch boxes from the same spot that you picked them yesterday. And we have a special movie screening tonight. The movie basically is called Till Kingdom Come by an Emmy awarded Israeli journalist. It gives you a window about Christian Zionists, a closer input from her. It has been drawing a lot of scrutiny and a lot of controversy due to its brave, let's say, method of tackling this issue. So tonight at 9, here at this hall, you're going to have the chance to watch for free one of the best movies about this issue. So don't forget. And now we're going to proceed with our next speaker, who, before screening his bio, I want to tell you one thing about him. Any conversation with him will leave you extra intellectual and more informative. He never leaves you without giving you a plus information or tip. So I'm very honored to welcome with you all, John Munayer.
John Munayer. John's many academic degrees in theology, international relations, and politics gave him a strong base to focus his research on Palestinian theology, the Palestinian Christian community, and on interreligious dialogue. Please, let's all welcome John Munayer.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's a privilege and an honor to be with you here today. As a young Palestinian Christian, I have to say that Christ at the Checkpoint has been an extremely influential conferences and the people involved on my life and my journey with Christ. And it's extremely a privilege to be in the same session with Reverend Moss. And you might not remember this, Reverend Moss, but in 2014, I was at the conference and I was a volunteer. And I was the security guard at the conference. So you might be thinking, why does Christ at the Checkpoint need a security guard? Which is a good question. But perhaps a better question is, why did they put me as a security guard? I've been asked by Youssef and by Munder to speak about loving my neighbor, liberating them from Zionist supremacy. So if I very much relate to Tony with the controversial title and talk. But let me situate myself in this conversation, my personal journey. Me and my 3 siblings, we grew up in an Israeli school. The 4 of us, and perhaps 1 or 2 more Palestinians, were the only Palestinians in this Israeli school. And when I was 9, there was an incident at school. It didn't involve me, it involved my oldest brother. Kids who were older than him were threatening to tie him to a tree because he was Palestinian. Not only did they want to tie him to a tree, but because he was Palestinian, they wanted to tie him like Jesus. This is just one of many examples and slurs that we heard at school, such as dirty Arab and filthy Arab. As a kid, it would install a new fear, perhaps even an inferiority complex. A few years later, I was driving with my father to football practice, and we were picking up a bunch of Israeli teammates on the way. And I asked him not to answer any work calls, because they might be in Arabic. He slammed the brakes in the middle of the road, turned towards me with the most serious face, and said, "Never ever be ashamed of who you are. Never ever change because of their racism. You change them. You confront them." This installed in me this sense of empowerment to try and confront racism and supremacy. And a few years after that, I was working, saving up for my university studies as a cleaner in Jerusalem. And I happened to clean this old lady. She was a new immigrant Zionist's house. And she was probably wanting to have a bit of conversation, and she asked who I was. And I told her I was Palestinian. And she insisted that there was no such thing as Palestinians. I didn't back down. I confronted her. The Zionist supremacy and racism. The next day, I received a phone call from my boss. I was fired from that position. Sorry? I paid the price of losing a job. Yesterday, Zaid, a 15-year-old, lost his life in Al-Khadir, not far from here, whilst we were in the conference. 15 years old, shot in his neck and his back. How then do we love our Zionist neighbor? We've heard Jesus' commandment to love our neighbor, Jesus is asking us to love our oppressor. How does the colonized love the colonizer? How does the oppressed love the oppressor? How does the neck love the sword? And when I talk about my Zionist neighbor, I'm talking about both Christians and Jews who live here and also abroad. Because we have many Christian Zionists who come to our land for many, many years and invest their time, resources, and money to oppress us. They have the audacity to come to our land and oppress us in the name of Jesus. When I speak of Zionist supremacy, I speak of the state of mind or behavior, whether conscious or not, that views white people or Jews as superior to Palestinians, either on the basis of religion, ethnicity, or the two identities combined. That is to say, any position that places Palestinians in civil or spiritual inequality is supremacy. And this, of course, falls under the ideology of settler colonialism. Even liberal Zionists at times fall under this sin of supremacy. They're often willing to do things that are only comfortable for them. They're happy to help Palestinians if it doesn't threaten their privilege. I know this is not the topic, but this is also true for non-Zionist supporters of Palestinians. In essence, Zionist supremacy is a form of white supremacy. Like other settler colonials, it began in Europe, and while having a legitimate reason to find an alternative to anti-Semitism, it sought to fulfill its mission and dream on non-European land. In many ways, Zionism can be understood as a liberation movement or theology gone wrong. And if you doubt that the white supremacy and Zionism is connected, please look at the way the state and the Zionist movement has treated Jewish Arabs and black Jews as well. How they've treated them and still treat them today. How then do we love our Zionist neighbors? Can we move from love that is simply be nice, putting your head down, forgiving, to something more like the meaning of the word intifada, shaking aggressively Zionist supremacy? We can see this form of tough love in Jesus' ministry, when he rebukes abusive teachings and behavior. At times, he even used aggressive language, flipped tables, and drove people away with a whip. In a similar manner, when a family member commits an injustice or has racist opinions, it's our jobs as family members to call them out, right? This is what makes family gatherings and dinners and WhatsApp groups so entertaining. Love can be correcting, upsetting, uncomfortable, but it is still love. Just as we Palestinians need liberating from settler colonialism, Zionists need liberating too. When Zionists view Palestinians as subhuman and view themselves as superhuman, they are under captivity. They are captive to their own racism and egos, which allows them to beat and kill Palestinians or remain silent when they do, even at their funerals. Zionism is incompatible with love. We Palestinians and our liberation is actually the secret to Zionist liberation and their liberation from sin of supremacy. So today I wish to share with you some thoughts and the processes that me and many other young Palestinian Christians, when we have to deal with this idea of Zionist supremacy. How do we liberate our Zionist neighbors? And I'm going to talk about 3 main points. The first one, and this was the slide that interrupted Munder's presentation. Now you know that it was mine. It was a teaser. The first step to liberating our Zionist neighbor, we first need to liberate ourselves, our minds. When we love ourselves, then we can love our neighbor. And we'll be able to do it better when we love ourselves. This means that we need to refuse the inferior position, status, or role that Zionists place upon us. We're not the younger brother of Israeli Jews. We're not the sons of Ishmael. And we're not primitive people, as some people would put it. The mind of colonized people is always under attack. And we need to pay attention to that. Colonial projects seek to dominate the minds of the people they colonize just as much as they seek to dominate the land. These notions must be rejected. We are Palestinian Christians, the native people of the land, the custodians of the holy sites, and we've been preaching the gospel and living the gospel for hundreds of years. We should not let our oppressors define who we are. Being Palestinian is beautiful. It's creative, steadfast, fun, and most importantly, tasty. When you truly love yourself, you let people know about who you are. You're not ashamed. And if they're not willing to accept who you are, no problem. Then they can prepare for a struggle. Because when you love yourself as a Palestinian, you are going to fight with all of your Palestinian being against the forces that seek to keep you under oppression. Sadly, however, a lot of my Palestinian Christian brothers and sisters have bought into Zionist, Orientalist, and racist views of themselves. They've allowed colonial rhetoric to define who they are and continue to sleep in a colonial prison, a mental imprisonment where the invisible bars follow you wherever you are. Unfortunately, I see and hear more and more Palestinian Christians, specifically from the evangelical community and leadership, who struggle to liberate themselves from the tight colonial grip. Because you see, the tight colonial grip often comes with perks, money, position, recognition. But it comes at the expense of submission, silence, self-hate, and at times betrayal of the gospel itself. In fact, many Palestinian Christian leaders themselves replicate version of colonial powers within their own communities. Something to be aware of. I think the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus can help us navigate through this complex situation that we face with a lot of Uncle Toms. And we have a lot of Uncle Toms. Many people were actually speaking very nicely about the young adults group and our movement. But we differ very much from the older generation as much as we respect them in terms of how to deal with a lot of the Uncle Toms, the Palestinian Christians who are willing to work with the Zionists on the expense of our suffering. It wasn't easy coming to this conference. Even this conference can also be viewed critically through the lens of coloniality and self-love. Who has been our target audience? Why have we targeted in them? Who has been speaking? Who hasn't been speaking? I don't wish to talk about that too much, but it just seems at times that it's much harder to work through our own internal problems, to bring together all of the leaders and activists when international people are not involved, when there isn't an international audience, when there isn't a big stage or a platform or broadcasting. Loving oneself means self-empowerment, empowerment of your own community. Even our theology is often based on white Western sources, male sources, sorry, forgetting our rich and fertile land on which we live in. Some say that this is because we don't have a lot of sources in Arabic, right? But the language isn't the problem, it's our method. We need to look internally, not externally. To create a Palestinian theology, we must look internally to our practices, culture, art. It's beautiful, it's rich. That's our basis for our theology. For the Holy Spirit is active among the people who fight racism and supremacy and therefore become a theological source within themselves. Self-love is building a theology on the basis of our experience and suffering. It should speak in and through our theology. Only then can we struggle against the yoke of oppression and trauma. Let us move now to our neighbor. There are many areas to focus on in terms of methods of trying to liberate our neighbor. I've chosen confrontation. Confrontation is often seen as something very negative. And also, I think we really lack it in our Palestinian church, specifically evangelical. Confrontation at times is uncomfortable, culturally inappropriate, and you have to pay a high price for it. But isn't this what Jesus did in his ministry? Making people in power uncomfortable by doing and saying culturally inappropriate things and paying for a high price. He died because of it. We need to recognize that we Palestinians are the key to freeing our Zionist neighbors from their oppressive identity. In many ways, their ethical success or failure is subject to the way they treat us. It is our vocation to expose the Zionist and colonial dream. We need to expose this Zionist dream because the Zionist dream is the Palestinian nightmare. And we need to expose their theology. We need to expose Zionist theology because it's not as if they're just wearing Zionist and white supremacist glasses when they read the Bible. It's not enough just to take the glasses off. They need a medical operation. It's like Zionist and white supremacist cataract. A medical operation on both eyes. That's what we need. Reading the Bible from a Zionist perspective is like reading the Bible from a Roman perspective. The position of power and privilege. But the cross prevents dominant people and racist people from accepting and embracing the meaning of Jesus. No one can oppress people, kill them, starve them, put them in open-air prisons, and then still understand and embrace the message of Christ. It doesn't work. We're in Bethlehem today, not far from Jerusalem. It wasn't the powerful, the religious leaders, and the intellects who understood and embraced the gospel, nor was it the direct audience of Christ himself. But it was the marginalized, a teenage woman, shepherds, foreigners and sick, the poor and people living under occupation who embraced the gospel and who Christ revealed himself to. We need to say this loud and clear: Zionist theology and ideology is not Christian, period. In order to understand the cross and the gospel, you have to read it through the eyes of the marginalized and the oppressed. Therefore, in this context, you need to read it through the eyes of Palestinians. To truly understand the crucified Christ, you must understand and embrace the suffering Palestinians of today. You cannot embrace Christ and ignore Yad al-Hala or Shireen Abu Akleh or the many young Palestinians who get killed every day. There's no supremacy in God's kingdom. And as John the Baptist reminds us, when he's speaking to an audience who think that their background gives them privileges, don't think you can say to yourselves, Abraham is our father. I tell you, God can raise up children for Abraham even from these stones. Zionists need to wake up from their deep spiritual and theological sleep. But of course, Christian and Jewish Zionists don't want to wake up. They don't want to face reality because the reality is ugly. So it is our job to force them. This is part of our Christian vocation, speaking to power and exposing injustices. This is exactly what our Savior Jesus Christ did. This is, of course, easier said than done. And it requires bravery and confrontation and at times aggressive behavior. And it's particularly difficult when, as Palestinians, we've experienced a lot of trauma. We're fearful. But like the prophet Jeremiah, we are afraid to confront the powers and deal with the social pressures. But we also need to remember God's reply to Jeremiah. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and I will rescue you. The third step into liberating our neighbor. It means maintaining integrity and equal standards. If we examine critically our own supremacy and racism, it will help us in our fight to expose the racism of our neighbors. The fact that we might be victims doesn't mean that we can't be racist and supremacist to other groups. And if we claim that specifically Jewish Zionists need to rid themselves of supremacy and racism, we need to rid ourselves of any racist attitude towards Jews. It can't be tolerated. Embracing European Christian forms of anti-Semitism is embracing the ideology of the very colonial powers we seek to fight. However, in Palestinian Christian society, embracing supremacist attitudes over the Jews is a problem, but we have a bigger problem. It's embracing a supremacist attitude towards our Palestinian Muslim brothers and sisters. It is actually quite shocking and embarrassing the way many Palestinian Christians, and indeed many evangelical leaders, speak about Muslims. Islamophobic theology and ideology has blinded us from seeing the humanity in many of our Arab Muslim brothers and sisters. We even have Palestinian evangelical leaders who raise their money this way. They go around talking to Western audiences badly about Muslims. It's online, you can look it up. And the Western audiences, of course, love it. They claim that Muslims are the main problem that we have in society. It's not rare to hear it's not rare to hear Christians speak about Muslims in calling them primitive, backwards, filthy, violent, and non-educated. The same rhetoric Zionists use to call us and describe us. How hypocritical of ourselves. We cannot seek to liberate our Zionist neighbors of supremacy and at the same time hold supremacist views of our Muslim brothers and sisters. And what is even more embarrassing is often the Palestinian Muslims are at the receiving end of the most brutal policies of Israel. We, the Christians, are the privileged in this scenario, and we must remember that. Speaking of double standards, let us not also forget of the supremacy we Palestinian men have over our sisters. Once again, we can't ask for liberation from Zionism and then oppress women in our society. And it's not enough to say that you support women and empower them and give them a position there and a position here, and then dominate them in all areas of society and the church. Our dear sister Marah spoke about this yesterday, and many others as well. And at times, I can see the reaction from a lot of the men. They might be angry, upset, frustrated, and they might be thinking to themselves, how dare they speak like that? This is the exact feeling that Zionists have when they hear us speak. The reaction of an oppressor. To conclude, I hope and pray Zionists would open their eyes and heart to their supremacy and great suffering that comes with it. For what they do to us has ramifications to themselves. As for us, we need to get our act together. We need to start liberating our mind and our neighbor, because we are constantly thinking and acting at times out of panic and survival. We're trying to survive as Palestinians in apartheid, trying to survive as Christians in a small community, trying to survive with all the rest of life's challenges. Some churches have adopted a survival type of mindset, making sure to secure their buildings, pastor's salary, and more. To a large extent, we're too concerned with our own survival. We've embraced the gospel of survival. But the gospel of Jesus is not a gospel of survival. The gospel of Jesus is ultimate victory through failure. That is why our faith is centered around the cross. Jesus did not survive. He was nailed and killed on the cross. But God took that failure and transformed it to ultimate victory. The gospel is not obvious. It's not obvious. And I feel that if the Palestinian evangelical church is missing this message of the cross, then we will become not relevant to society. And we'll lose our importance. Survival should not be our mission. Because as Jesus said, whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will save it. Thank you.
Reverend Moss Nutella. Reverend Moss is the General Secretary of the Evangelical. Is engaged in public policy and advocacy both in South Africa and internationally. He is a church planter, disciple maker, and activist for justice. Please, let's all welcome Reverend Moss Nutella.
How does one follow an act like that? John, thanks for your amazing and passionate plea for us to take a listen at the militancy of youth and the confrontational nature that you bring to this challenge that we are facing. Brothers and sisters, I'm delighted to be here with you. It's for us, and I joined my colleagues who were here yesterday, Reverend Frank Chikani and others, who stand amazed at the resilience, at the courage that you represent. And I was just reflecting this morning about how on earth, looking at the scenes that you look at daily, with guns pointed at you every day, and that becomes part of your reality daily. And we watched a documentary the other day, 2 days ago, and it was just so wrenching to watch how a father and a child look at this same scene and how they process these guns pointed at them in a menacing way. And that is not a once-off, that's the reality every day. And just to be able to stand alongside you and to, in some way, be in solidarity with you is a joy and a delight to us. And we do so, in a sense, with a conviction that this wall will fall. When we say this to other people from other parts of the world, they doubt it. But as South Africans, we have been treated by God to the front row seat of watching how apartheid collapses eventually. And we are witnesses of that reality, that apartheid has built within itself the seeds of its own destruction. And so as we see the faith that we see manifest in all of the people that we've met here, especially young people, we know that that's all it takes. There's a text, a lovely text in the Bible that I have loved for many years now. It's in Mark 11, verse 22. It talks about how mountains move. Jesus says, if you have this kind of faith, small, and you say to this mountain, move and go to the sea, fall into the sea, and you do not doubt in your heart it will happen. And I say this as one who has seen a mountain of apartheid go to the sea and disappear. And so it may take a long time. Our struggle is one of the longest on our continent, over 100 years. And if you count other skirmishes with colonialism before then, it can be even much longer. But there never was a doubt that someday it will disappear. And so with action, with courage, with faith, we believe that this struggle will be won, and that God will eventually show himself Lord. Amen? I've been asked to speak on apartheid and the theology of segregation, and I think that the job has been done for me somewhat by what Reverend Francescani did yesterday. So that gives me permission to stray a little bit from that topic. And let me start with the question that this conference is organized around, which is this: am I my brother's keeper? Thank you, Muncha, for the way that you treated us to that reflection a couple of days ago, and all of the other speakers who've spoken on it. Thanks, Yusuf, for what you did with that question yesterday. I want to come at that question in a different way and say that that question is very typical of a program of self-justification. And the thing with self-justifying theological programs is that they come after you have killed someone. It comes after the act. It comes after you find yourself in a mess and are trying to figure out how to feel better. And so that question was the way Cain was saying that he's asking God the question, am I my brother's keeper? And my sense is that, and Mutta was saying, and it is true, that at least in this country, it is the case that the wall that was finally built here existed in the minds of people before it was built, which is true. But it is also true to say, it's almost like a chicken and an egg, that what comes first, in our experience in South Africa, and in Africa more broadly, you have colonialism. It takes many forms in different parts of our continent. The Spanish came, the Dutch came, the British, the Germans, the French. All of these people were colonial countries of Europe. And so what they then did in Africa was what they do. And so, in a sense, and this is one of the reasons that the charge of Christian Zionism does not work with us very much in South Africa, at least. Because in a sense, we realize how it is that the same people who supported our own colonization, our own oppression, are the same ones who say that it is okay for Israel to do what it is doing in the Holy Land. It's very difficult to agree with them. When Europe says this Christian Zionism is a legitimate way to look at Scripture, it rings a bell in our memory that they said that about apartheid in our case, and they saw nothing wrong with the suffering of millions of people, and even used scripture to justify it. So if those people say the same thing and they justify what is a brutal system here, we almost disagree before we even go any far with listening. And so in a sense, it is because we know that Europe has done all of these things. And so in a sense, if you think about, and I use the names of Lord Balfour because I saw him yesterday evening at the World Hotel, Hold Up Hotel. He was sitting there in the corner. And so before all of these architects of Zionism, Theodore Herzl, it is not possible to conceive of Zionism, of what happened here before you had a European milieu that was well steeped in a culture, in the habit of colonizing people. So Europe was right and ready for that to happen, and with the connivance, assistance, it became possible for Zionism to become what it is today, and supported, as Munta helpfully helped us to remember yesterday, that actually Christian Zionism predates Zionism proper in a sense. And so in that way, my suspicion, let me put it that way, is that for that to happen, you needed a colonial Europe to sanction it. And you needed the U.S. with the notoriety of what they did in the discovery of the Americas and what they did to Native Americans. You needed people of that cultural context to sponsor this project. So because of that, my affirmation is you first need murder. You need the murdering of millions of people's cultures, millions of people's lives must be destroyed before you actually theologize about it to make yourself feel better. So that's the mutilation I want to do to that question, Muntar. In a sense, it's my take on it, and I'll tell you why. And in our country, let me move this a bit. In our country, we've seen a lot of this, and I made some generous quotations there just to give you a sense of what apartheid theology or theologians got up to with the scriptures. And this is a very early text in the 1944s. It's a text by theologians of the Dutch Reformed Church at a time when colonialism was well and truly underway in South Africa. It started in the 1600s, but the first time the Afrikaner was ready to take power and perfect what became apartheid from its colonial past, you had this thing happening with Afrikaner theology, and they used creation theology, chapter 1 of Genesis, and chapter 11, all of which say, chapter 1 says that God created all things and separated the darkness from the light, separated the dry land from the waters, separated the animals one after each kind. And that kind of theological reasoning led in the mind of the Afrikaner apologists of apartheid to the fact that God is not only one who creates unity, the beauty of unity, but he does it in a way that divides them. So it is necessary for black and white to separate, be divided, and to separate development. And that's the language that was used for apartheid. It was meant not as a harmful, mischievous, deadly program that it was. It was meant, at least as the way that they framed it, separate development. When you hear that, you get a sense it is separating like that. You don't get it is separating like that. And in that sense, you get to miss the brutality and the oppression of it. And it's very clear, obviously, in this country as well. Outside of this country, people think that the two-state solution is a reasonable, fair way of talking about the way forward in this country. And it is because they haven't been here in some ways, or it is because they haven't seen what happens from the other side of the wall. And I'll give you a bit of my own story and my entry into the journey, my journey with Palestinian Christians. My name is not Mos, it is Moses. My father's name is David. What does that tell you? It tells you this, that my family, the heroes of Israel, are the heroes of my family. So we love Israel. And so when we read the story in the Bible, you know, I don't know if there's an evangelical in the world who looks at the Bible and takes any other side than the side of David and the side of Moses, you know. But that's before you come here. And so a few years ago, I was asked by the government to be part of a commission in South Africa of what, after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to help our country move beyond the TRC. In other words, you had, in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you had things said about different people. And the possibility was that there could be more hatred when you now know what happened to your loved ones, the brutality with which they were killed and so on. I mean, Reverend Frank didn't tell you this, but one of the things that happened to him was that he was poisoned. Chemical weapons were used upon him and he almost died. And how did that happen? They took his bag as he went into an airplane to travel somewhere and put poison in his clothes. And when he changed clothes were at a point of destination, he just became sick. It just so happened that he was traveling in the US and they found out that it was poisoning. And that was almost after he was dead, because a priest was called to say the last rites, because Frank was meant to die. And the confession came at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that the regime did it. And Frank always thought that he was Christian enough to forgive, you know. But when he came face to face with the guy who told him, I did it, you were meant to die. And so the rage came up again, and John, you would understand what he wanted to do with that guy. But then he had to wrestle with the fact that this is post-apartheid. We have to figure out how to provide leadership about what happens next. Now, I say that to say, after that, there was a possibility of alienation between different groups. and I served in a commission on culture, religion, and language to see how these could then be helped to work together so that we build a society that can move away from the apartheid past. On that commission, I served with a Jewish friend because she represents the Jewish community, which is a small percentage of the community, but we are being inclusive. It's a post-apartheid society, and so she invites me to come to Israel. Oh yeah, I'm interested, actually. I hadn't been to this country, so I go here and I find, and I'm blown away by just being able to read the Bible in Bethlehem. Well, in Bethlehem here, it was just in a tourist bus, but, you know, we weren't allowed to talk to you guys because you'd kill us and so. But I kept asking the question, what's this with these guns? What's this with these checkpoints? And I was saying to my fellow travelers on this, because there was a whole group of South Africans, I told them, every time I see this scenario, every time I see young people throw stones at military, very heavily armed people, automatically, without asking questions, I side with the young people. That's my own history. That's what I grew up doing. And I know young people don't do mad things like that unless they have a good reason. And so it's just, you have to listen to them, then you'll know they're right. And so in that sense, they kept wishing it away, explaining, until I was invited by Palestinian friends to participate in the journey towards writing the Palestinian Kairos, because I was part of the Kairos process in South Africa. So, and then all the things began to click. Now, I tell you that story because, in a sense, let me complete it. I went back to South Africa and confronted my Jewish friend and said, why did you put me into a program like that? And one of the things, by the way, we did was an environmental project of planting trees in a forest somewhere in what is now Israel. It's a forest that was presented as a green environmental project where, you know, the idea is to plant trees everywhere because the Arabs didn't plant trees. And so on my second visit, I go to the same place where I planted this tree because that was ceremonial, planting trees in this. I was with the South African delegation, mainly Jewish people. And so I meet a Palestinian who used to live in this forest. It's called the South Africa Forest, sponsored by South African Jewry. And he tells me, you see this forest here? It's in Israel. He shows me where his home was in this forest. He shows me where the animals used to drink. He shows me where the mosque used to be. And he shows me the boundaries of the household, the carcass. I think there's a little plant that was used in those days before 1948 to draw up to the borders of households. And he shows me all of this. And you can imagine the fury building up in my own heart as I thought. So what I was doing was to actually plant a tree to erase the memory of a village that was destroyed before 1948 and present it as a green project. And so I learned then that it was not the only village that was erased in that way. It was one of hundreds of villages that had the same fate, that were now green projects, and where some Jews from other parts of the world were sponsoring trees to erase the memory of people who used to live there. That propaganda that was used by the state, in a sense, was also in South Africa a similar propaganda where the darkest atrocities perpetrated by apartheid South Africa were covered up in such language, in such terms, as to conceal the hideous ways in which apartheid dealt with us. And unfortunately, there were many around the world who believed the narrative of white South Africa. Now, I say this to say that to the degree that there was a dominant theology in South Africa that took as its departure point the reality that you have this separation of people that was separate for their own good, to develop them in their own way as they each prefer. Beneath that was horror. And so what was out the reality, in fact, beyond the rhetoric, beyond the cover-ups, was that apartheid was being built to last. It was built to perpetuate itself. And you can't believe how successful that project was. And as I look at the struggle here, I'm hoping that it will be possible to undercut some of the long-term effects of what Israel is sowing into the fertile soil of this land, by way of hatred, by way of underdeveloping people deliberately. In South Africa's terms, the apartheid was entrenched in every section of life, every part of our lives, from where we were born to where we go to school, where we are buried. Everything from the womb to the grave was determined by apartheid. The education system was so skewed, and I was telling young people yesterday that when I was growing up, I wanted to be an engineer because I thought I live in Africa, and therefore, you want to develop the place and become part of a solution. I found out when I finished high school that I couldn't. You can't be both black and an engineer at the same time, because that was saved only for white people. By the time 1994 came, South Africa the illiteracy rate was what? About 60%, which means 30 years later, this is 30 years after the 1994, people ask often, how do you transform this society? How is it that the opportunities that are now available for all to access were policy, from the policy standpoint, from the constitution standpoint, everything has been transformed to make it possible for everyone to participate. But the problem is that you can't if you have not got an education to enable you to do that. If you were 30 years old by 1994, hardly literate, but you had a job in the mining industry that was created in a way that didn't need educated people. Even when they say education is now free, all through high school, you can go to school, but nobody wants to go to school when you're 30. So 30 years later, you are what, 60? You still can't read or write. And even if you did, because government did try to get some literacy program, fast track that, even with the best effort, the majority of the people still are in the long job queues where you queue up with graduates even who have now come up, they are younger, they would like to participate, but they are also unemployed. And so it just perpetuates the inequality. So apartheid in that sense was built to last it was with a long-range view of creating a black underclass that forever serves white interests. The role played by religion in that, as is indeed the case here, is obvious. You need a theological legitimation for the programs, for the program that you have in place. You need a strong military. South Africa was a regional power in Africa. In fact, it still is to this day. You needed a powerful army to preserve white interest in a continent that is black. And so when you think about Israel being similarly a regional superpower here, you understand that to maintain oppression, you need a very strong army, and you need an economics that guarantees that. You need a cultural expression of that oppression that makes sure that this continues for as long as it takes. The churches responded to that in different ways, and I realize I'm running out of time, so I will just the best way to understand what churches did with themselves over that period is best told in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. All churches, and I look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as our national altar call, an opportunity offered to all South Africans to say exactly what it was they did and why. The promise was, if you tell us the truth, you will be forgiven. There will be amnesty given you. Whatever atrocities you committed, you don't even have to be remorseful about it. All you have to say is, what did you do? Where are the people you killed secretly, who disappeared, who you buried in unmarked graves elsewhere? So people could find closure. So you had an opportunity to tell us what you did. And that's the hope was that this truth-telling that did not have the luxury to require remorse, was otherwise, where would you get remorse? People were not remorseful. If they had another opportunity, they'll do it again. And so a lot happened with regard to that for the victims, and I worked very much with the victims of human rights. We were very unhappy with this, obviously. I remember joining a group of church leaders, going to the president. At that time, it was President Thabo Mbeki, and he was trying to justify this arrangement where there was, if people tell the truth, no remorse, they are given amnesty, and their victims, they get reparations. But you can imagine, this reparation, we're a third world country pretty much. So how is reparations going to look like? You've lost a leg, or your eyes, you are blind because some bullet went into your head, or you lost your parents. What reparation is fair? And so, particularly if the other side just gets amnesty, there's not even a requirement to pay back what they took. And so the president answers this question this way. he says two things. One is that this is a democratic government that you are asking to pay for the atrocities of the previous one, that all of us put our lives in line to dismantle. And now we have the serious task now to rebuild this society. We don't have extra cash. We've got to pull ourselves by our bootstraps. And I was thinking to myself as I listened to him that, so you are sitting in the president's chair, and you can say this, because you are the president, what more do you want? I have a friend who is blind or in a wheelchair who can't participate in this freedom. But that became the reality of our story, that in that process, the churches also came forward, because there were churches that churches were given the opportunity to explain themselves. Why did you do the things that you did? Why did you support apartheid? What was your rationale? And what will you do differently going forward? And so it was with because apartheid affected the legal, the medical, police. Doctors were collaborating with the police. They were required to do that, to report on people who were running away from the police, injured, and were in hospital. So there were all sorts of collaborationist arrangements that our society had. But what's interesting with the confessions of the churches, which goes back to the practice of churches, but also the theology by which they did it. All of them from the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church in South Africa is one of those very progressive churches that have come up often always with the most progressive, prophetic denunciation of the human rights that were going on. But it's one thing when this comes from the top of the church leaders and it doesn't affect the life of the Christian community. And so on the chair of the TRC was a man called Desmond Tutu. The cardinal of the Catholic Church comes there and he says, Arch, you know, as Catholics, we have harmed this country. I don't know if you know the name of Chris Hani. Chris Hani was the second most popular leader, liberation leader, next to Nelson Mandela. Before 94, he was shot and killed, assassinated, just as we were heading towards the election. In fact, he was still negotiating these elections. And the Catholic cardinal says, do you know who killed Chris Hani? It is a Catholic. And you know Chris Hani is a Catholic. So both of them, both the assassin and Chris Hani, were Catholics. So we are a mixed bag. And I suppose that's the story of the church. And so story after story, the Anglican Church came forward. On the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a Bishop Tutu, a man who was persecuted by the Anglican Church. They demonized him, Anglican bishops, white Anglican bishops who opposed him at every turn. They were now confessing and saying, Arch, there's no need to lie. You know what we did to you. We demonized you. We called you all sorts of names. We attacked your witness. We're sorry. We betrayed the people of this country. We betrayed Jesus Christ. We betrayed the gospel. We hope you can forgive us. And on, Pentecostals, charismatics, evangelicals. I had the good or bad fortune of reading the confession of the evangelical community. And it was the same. I come out of a tradition, evangelicals are notoriously conservative. And so I had to go back and tell them, what is it about evangelical theology that so personalizes our relationship with God that it becomes a useful tool for anyone who wants to use it as a tool to oppress. And so that confession is there in the public record. You can read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of all of our traditions. I say all of that to say that and I'll close with this text because I think I've done damage to the time. That what has been very clear in the story of how churches responded and participated or collaborated with apartheid is often the way they sided with power and tried to ensure their survival by being part of the power arrangements of society, was seduced by power. And so this text where Jesus talks about, when we can think about the Lord Jesus as one, he came to this, he was born here, you know him better, so. Became the most powerful human being. He was, to tell you the truth, he was God, disguised. But he just set aside every power, every glory, everything. Became a man born here, born the time that he was born. Always wondered why he wasn't born when there are cars or could drive. So he walked the length and breadth of this on foot. Became an absolute servant, responded to even the poorest, blind people who called him, asking him to heal. He would stop the whole entourage, just attend to that man. Was obedient unto death, laying aside all of his glory to participate in what it means to love others. And I think it was beautifully portrayed in the devotion in the morning about how he lives in us and hopes we will agree to go where he went. And so that's the only way we can escape the trappings, the capture of the church, in order that the witness of Jesus Christ may be fully unleashed in our cultures, in our generation. Whether you are in Europe, the Americas, Palestine, Africa, our task is to figure out how to disconnect from temporal, secular power, whether it's economic, political, social, whatever power it is, to just serve the cause of Christ. Thank you.
Thank you, John and Reverend Moss. I was thinking as I'm listening to John and Reverend Moss that a lot of conferences, and either like religious conferences or political conferences, feature a soliloquy about being the change. But to be honest, what's special about this conference is that all of our speakers embodies change. And there is no change without Jesus Christ, because he is the positive change that we need. John was talking to us about the liberation from Zionism and the need to liberate ourselves from or let's say the need for self-liberation to be part of the process as we're liberating ourselves from Zionist or Zionism. And having dinner yesterday with Reverend Moss, we talked about the need to liberate our faith in order to see beyond occupation and beyond apartheid. Both messages gives me hope and remind me of a quote that is very much used in Hebrew in the Israeli political speeches by Theodor Herzl. If you will, there is no dream. Im tirtzu zulu agada. Now we're going to have questions for both inspiring speakers.
Hey.
Testing. Thank you very much. I'm emboldened and inspired by both of your talks. It reminds me of the words of the prophecy of Joel, of old men dreaming and young men seeing visions. So thank you very much. First of all, to John, you spoke briefly about the oppression of African Jews and others here in this land. And I wondered if there are any official efforts by Palestinians to join in solidarity with them. And then to Pastor Moss, my question is, how would you respond to recent criticisms, particularly from the younger generation, about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that it basically failed, because they did not prosecute, as you said. And would you see something like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission happening and being effective for the eventual and inevitable end of apartheid here in Palestine?
Okay, we'll have more questions, and then we can answer all questions.
My question is to John, and I don't know if I have the right word that you used, but you said that you that you use resistance against what's happening to the Palestinians. I think that was the word you used, or confrontation. And I was just wondering what you meant by, like, what type of confrontation, what you meant by that.
We'll have one more question, and then we'll let the speakers to answer.
John, your talk was prophetic. Thank you. Like, I'm inspired. It was brilliant. And it reminded me that in the UK, whenever we have a Palestinian speaker, at least one of the questions will be asking them to talk about Israel. And I find that really frustrating and really hard. And when I was hearing your presentation, I was really thinking about Black consciousness and that movement that's been so inspirational, and how absolutely Palestinians need this. And that dialogue with Israelis, there's a massive power imbalance. And it almost re-traumatizes Palestinians when you're having to go through that dialogue. But then I was thinking that we in the West do that too. We don't listen to your voice. We don't elevate your voice. We think of the white voice. And then I'm wondering, like, is it also traumatizing for you to be in dialogue with us? What are we meant to do? Are we meant to elevate your voices? Are we meant to fight the Zionists for you? I can't fight it for you. You know it better than me, so I'm just asking for your advice. Thank you both.
Thank you. Speakers?
Am I on?
Yeah.
Yeah, let me do that question. I'll leave the other one to John. The thing about the reconciliation, and it's there is a challenge about the way that South Africa got to 94, where the end of apartheid happened. It was not like a complete victory and defeat of the enemy. It was a negotiated settlement. And that is an important point to bear in mind when you critique what comes next. Young people often say, you shouldn't have agreed to settle for that deal. And often it is because they come at it from a different time zone, in a sense. Because at that time, it's almost like a stalemate. You could say we should have continued the struggle till final victory. And in that case, then you don't negotiate. Then you dictate the terms. You arrest people, you do this. But when you are not, none of you is able to win. The military power doesn't work because nobody was fighting you militarily in that sense. So the government knew it couldn't win, but the people knew also that they are still far from defeating the enemy. But there was a sense in which an opportunity existed to shift the dial decisively in the positive direction, which was done. So one of the things that the criticism often connects with is the economics of the deal, that you don't have enough economic transformation, and made worse by the fact that those who perpetrated evil, as you say, were not prosecuted. Nelson Mandela comes out of prison. He is president. One of the first things he did, goes to the widow of Verwoerd. Verwoerd was the guy, the architect of apartheid. He goes to the widow, who's 90 years old at that time, or whatever it was, and he has coffee. And I wasn't in the room, obviously, but that picture has stuck in the psyche of our nation as one that says, you do need a Mandela to go tell Mrs. Verwoerd how the future should look like. So the possibility of crafting a new future without requiring the widow of Verwoerd to suffer, it's an important calling, and I think for the church, and I think that to your next question of would that apply here? I think all of us who are Christians have a problem, and that problem is Jesus. And he says to love the neighbor. We may debate how that looks like in real terms, in practice. Today it is obviously, the situation, we are not at that negotiation place, we are not at the place of agreeing together to build a new Holy Land architecture. But when that day comes, there will be no value in punishing people who were victims themselves of the system. And I know that John might disagree with me.
Thank you. I'll try and answer the questions briefly. So if you're not satisfied with the answer, please find me later and we can discuss. In terms of the Ethiopian Jews and other black Jewish communities and Arab Jews, that I know of, there isn't this sort of alliance of you could call it oppressed people by white supremacy in this context that I know of. And I think one of the reasons is even the Ethiopian Jews, to a certain extent, or to a large extent, embrace Zionism, which is an issue. So I think we need to communicate with one another that actually we're fighting the same fight of white supremacy in this land. In terms of the confrontation question, I'm thinking of a prophetic voice, both in words and action. And I had actually two audiences when I was thinking about this talk. The first is the Palestinian Christian, and even the Palestinian Christian evangelical, which at times I think are afraid to confront Christian Zionists or Jewish Zionists, or those who are sort of on the fence. So that was the idea behind confrontation. There's other things you can do, of course. I just wanted to focus on that. And that doesn't mean that, we should just confront and be aggressive to people, but do it through relationships. But confrontation and aggressiveness has to be part of the relationship. The question about dialogue with non-Zionists, you can call it, I don't know if European, North Americans, at times it's very problematic and traumatizing for us. There's people who come to this conference, hear our story, say they'll help us, they'll do X, Y, and Z, go back home and don't do anything. So we do experience that as well, and it can be a big problem. And that is one of the reasons some of the young people are saying we need to also focus more on our own community, rather than continue to ask people of privilege to help us.
Thank you both. Yeah. Okay, we're having the tour at 1. Don't forget to pick up your lunch boxes. And the tour, again, it's political and cultural tour with Salim. He's going to meet you at the entrance. Yes, Salim? Okay. And a reminder that we're having a movie tonight that I talked about. After this, we're going to have an interesting panels. It's a couple of panels. It's 3 panels. Each panel is going to be 50 minutes at this hall. They're going to be replaced, okay? Each panel after the other. And that's it. Enjoy the cultural and political tour.